All right, let's take a look at the last section in Chapter 3, namely Section 4. Let's practice as usual. Exercise 1. These are the fallacies of ambiguity. So problem 2 in the text, if you'd like to follow along. Every sentence in this paragraph is well written, therefore the paragraph is well written. So again, let's examine our reasoning here. Every sentence in the paragraph. So the sentences here are the parts, and the parts make up the whole, namely the paragraph. So in this particular example, we're reasoning from parts to whole, and just because you see the structure doesn't automatically mean that it's fallacious, but in this case, doesn't follow. The parts are well written, so the whole is well written. And on the surface, this might stand to reason here, but there's more that goes into a paragraph. What about style? What about flow? Is each sentence on the same topic? Usually one topic per paragraph. These sentences, though each is well written, might not have anything to do with one another. So parts to whole, in this case, that doesn't follow. And the fallacy here is composition. Parts to whole, composition. Again, just because you see that structure doesn't automatically mean that it's fallacious. You're going to have to examine the content here. But in this case, it doesn't make sense. Number 5 is pretty clear. Why is it so difficult for you to reach a decision? So the clue here is that it ends in a question mark. Now, of course, not all questions are fallacious, but this one certainly is. It's a complex question. And in a complex question, there is an assumption that hasn't necessarily been granted. We're assuming here that it is difficult for you to reach a decision and wondering why that's the case. Really, this should be 2 separate questions, and that's how you would need to respond to a fallacious question like this. The 2 questions being, number 1, is it difficult for you to make a decision? And if it is, why is that the case? But that it is difficult, that's not been granted, and therein lies the fallacy. Number 9, this I think is the trickiest one in the group, maybe the trickiest one in Chapter 3. 20 years ago, Kung Fong, the great sumo wrestler, could have yanked up one of the fir trees in the new municipal arboretum with a single pull. Therefore, since Mr. Fong is as strong today as he was then, he could just as easily pull up one of those trees today. And on the surface, again, this stands to reason. He could yank it up 20 years ago. He's just as strong as he was then, so therefore he could yank up the tree today. But this one is suppressed evidence. Suppressed evidence. What evidence is being ignored here that would, in fact, make a difference? Well, maybe Mr. Fong is just as strong as he was 20 years ago, but the fir tree, of course, has grown, you would expect, substantially over the course of the last 20 years. So 20 years ago, maybe the tree was freshly planted, and so he was actually strong enough, and that'd be still kind of impressive, to rip it up. But after 20 years of growth, deeper roots, it's highly unlikely that he could yank out a full-grown tree, or nearly a full-grown tree 20 years later, even though he's just as strong. So the suppressed evidence here that does make a difference, the suppressed evidence is, well, the tree's grown. So that's clearly fallacious. Number 10, this one's actually kind of an amusing one. If Thomas gives Marie a ring, then Thomas and Marie will be engaged. So notice the definition here of Thomas giving Marie a ring, referring to an engagement ring. Thomas did give Marie a ring, so they must be engaged. But in fact, he found her just the other night. So notice the definition of ring has changed. An engagement ring versus giving her a ring, phoning her up on the telephone. The definition of ring has changed, and this fallacy then is known as an equivocation. Sometimes referred to as a weasel word, but of course it's not fair to change the definition of a key term right in the middle of an argument. It's an equivocation on ring. Number 14. Each and every cell in this carrot is 90% water, therefore the entire carrot is 90% water. And 14 is actually pretty similar to the first one that we took a look at in this video. The second one is reasoning parts to whole, sentences to paragraph. This one, parts, the individual cells, to whole, the caret itself. Parts to whole. So same exact pattern. That first example that we took a look at was fallacious. Just because the sentences are well written doesn't mean that the whole paragraph is actually well written. Same structure here. Does this one make sense though? If each cell is 90% water, then the whole, the caret, would be 90% water, wouldn't it? So this one is in the form of composition, but the best answer here is no fallacy. So it's important, yes, to identify the structure, parts the whole, therefore, aha, it's composition. But in this case, take a closer look, that does stand to reason. Now, it's part of what can make chapter 3 confusing or tricky, and so practice here is of the utmost importance. One last example, this one too kind of silly. George said that he was interviewing for a job drilling oil wells in the supervisor's office. We can only conclude that the supervisor must have an awfully dirty office. Ha ha. So compare and contrast 10, let me slide back up there. 10 was an equivocation. The definition of a term changed right in the middle of the argument. 15 doesn't hinge on a term. The ambiguity doesn't hinge on a single term and how it's defined. In 15, the sentence itself is grammatically ambiguous. We could interpret it in two different ways. Of course, what the author is going for here is that the interview was conducted in the supervisor's office, but we could interpret it as though the drilling was going to be conducted in the office. And if you're going to drill for oil in an office, we can only conclude, haha, that the supervisor must have an awfully dirty office. So an equivocation, that's the case here in 10. An equivocation, single term is being equivocated. This one, it's grammatically ambiguous. And the name for this fallacy is kind of an odd one, amphiboly. Grammatically ambiguous, we can interpret that in two different ways. It's unclear what's meant. Of course, common sense would tell us that the interview, but just looking at what's written, it's grammatically ambiguous. It's not clear. It's an amphiboly.